is not able to vote this evening, unfortunately. We're now being recorded. So, next slide. On exactly this date last year, we presented on our achievements in what was then our first 5 months of operation. And those months were spent furiously working to meet the deadlines to establish IMPC in accordance with all the relevant regulations in order to start receiving the flow of funds from the City of Cape Town and then deploying them to begin implementing the business plan that you, the community, voted for. And when I look back on what we presented at the members' meeting on the 1st of December last year, I feel we'd effectively laid very good early foundations on which we now continue to build. The board's efforts remain focused on the 4 key pillars of public safety, environmental improvement, urban maintenance, and social responsibility. And then, of course, governance, ensuring we manage this company in accordance with all relevant regulations, policies, and our community's expectations. But perhaps most crucial of all is communications. Every property owner in our area contributes financially to the CID, and it is the board's important responsibility to ensure that we comprehensively and regularly disseminate information on how our funds are being deployed. Moving on to the next slide. In terms of governance and finance, the heavy lifting was done in the first few weeks post-inception to ensure we complied with all administrative requirements. Once up and running, our most important goal was ensuring our first year audit was seamless, and we're very pleased to report that we received a completely clean audit. Although in fairness, I believe virtually every one of the almost 50 CIDs in Cape Town achieved the same. Well, I think most of you are very well aware. I do want to stress once more that all directors give of their time wholly voluntarily and freely. None of the directors are paid for any of the time or effort they contribute to the CID. If we turn now to each of those 4 pillars. Firstly, public safety. From just under 50 this time last year, we now have 108 cameras in place. 78 have been added to the original Hout Bay Neighbourhood Watch network of 30, all of which were replaced with brand new hardware. The 108 is a slightly higher number than the original plan of 102 cameras, but reflects the fact that we have found the odd gap and weak point in our coverage and added extra cameras as a result. It also doesn't include the 3 cameras planned for along the walkway from Baviaanskloof Road to Military Road, for which unbelievably we are still seeking power. Just to be clear, when I talk about our cameras, in fact, we contracted Deep Blue for an end-to-end solution which encompasses the installation and maintenance of cameras and the monitoring, detection and response function. So the cameras are in fact the property of Deep Blue rather than sitting as an asset owned by the CID. This means even though we have broadly completed our camera installation, the ongoing cost of the network remains unchanged. It does also mean, however, that when the cameras have reached the end of their useful life after 3 years, rather than having material capital outlay to replace them, we merely renegotiate the terms of our contract with Deep Blue, who will replace hardware as necessary. The board considered and evaluated all options with respect to our CCTV network, and this model was without doubt the most cost-effective. It also enabled us to roll the camera network out as fast as Deep Blue was able to install, as we were not dependent on waiting for sufficient cash flow. Deep Blue assumes responsibility for daily assessment of the network to ensure all cameras are online, they undertake any necessary repairs or maintenance, and to replace any hardware which might fail completely. And when we come to renegotiate at the end of 3 years, we will be in a position to upgrade cameras to the latest technology without incurring the associated upfront expense. Coming back to the cameras themselves, they are all, of course, important, but the mountainside perimeter ones especially so. And we've conducted extensive nighttime testing to check their coverage. And while it might sound counterintuitive, we have had to engage with those homeowners who've installed floodlighting onto the mountain, as the light can hamper the camera's visibility. And reiterating something that we've stated many times before, the cameras are monitored 24. The cameras on the perimeter are monitored 24/7. Those in the interior, just in the hours of darkness. And this is purely to manage the practicality of the alerts that would be generated if the analytics were running on the internal cameras through the daytime as people go about their business in our area. It's very important to stress, though, that this doesn't mean the cameras are not functioning during daylight hours. Quite the contrary. Well, we have again spoken about this several times. I want to take a moment to clarify what monitoring means. When the software analytics are actively being monitored, if an alert is triggered, i.e. someone or something has been detected in the camera view, then the relevant camera screen is forced into the view of the operator in the control room, who has to take action. And that would be either determine that it's a false alarm or dispatch response to investigate. During the daytime, the camera views are still scrolling on loops through the control room, which means from time to time, incidents will be detected manually by the operators. And this happened quite recently with the control room operators noticing a bag of cement being stolen from a construction site on Scott Road, and both the bag and the thief were apprehended. Well, rather, the bag was returned to its rightful owner. And it's very important to understand that all the cameras are always rolling, and if needed, the footage can be accessed day or night and facilitate catching wrongdoers. Again, a recent example of this in practice would be the theft of a backpack from a removal van in our area. While the incident wasn't captured, once it was reported, the controllers were able to quickly identify several images of a lady carrying the stolen backpack on cameras in the vicinity. And clearly the old adage about not returning to the scene of the crime doesn't apply, since somewhat remarkably, she was spotted the very next day in our area in the same outfit, carrying the same backpack. So Deep Blue picked her up and she was taken to the police station, where I understand the owner of the backpack had laid charges. Whatever the outcome of that case, hopefully the message came through loud and clear that our area is being monitored and is to be avoided by those with criminal intent. And as a reminder that Deep Blue, as well as maintaining and monitoring all our cameras, is contracted as the response provider for our entire area. That means regardless of whether or not you pay them to attend to your private residential alarm, if you see anything concerning or suspicious in our public spaces, Deep Blue should be your first port of call. We have a dedicated patrol vehicle in our area 24/7, so please save the Deep Blue number on your cell phone and encourage those who work for you to do the same. That being said, we know CCP, Community Crime Prevention, are always quick to respond to any call for help throughout Hout Bay, and this is why we continue to provide monthly financial support to them and have donated a vital piece of medical equipment, but more of that later. But to this end, please also ensure that you have the WatchCon number saved to your phone, WatchCon being managed by CCP. While CCP may play the more visible support role, the reality is that Hout Bay Neighbourhood Watch also plays a vital role in crime reduction in our valley. Hout Bay Neighbourhood Watch is responsible for installing and maintaining what are described as the community cameras in Hout Bay, i.e. those in the public spaces, for example, by the beach and along Chapman's Peak. We can also thank them for the licence plate recognition cameras at the entrance points to the valley. They maintain all the high sites and network infrastructure for these cameras and the WatchCon radio network, including having installed backup batteries for connectivity during load shedding. So we're very pleased to have had sufficient additional funds in our public safety portfolio to commence regular monthly donations to Hout Bay Neighbourhood Watch too. Okay, moving on to environmental improvement with a quick water break. Bear with me. Environmental improvement, this is an extremely important portfolio for SEBCID. On a day-to-day basis, Andrew Preen and his team at Allo Africa continue to maintain our public open green spaces, and I sincerely hope we can all see the fruits of their labour, not only in the park by Main Road, but throughout. We're very happy that Stephen and Ali, and if we could just skip on a couple of slides to the first picture, there we go. I'm very happy that Stephen and Ali, who were brought in by Andrew at inception, are still our same two dedicated staff. This brings consistency, local knowledge, and above all, familiarity. And I hope, like me, many of you are on waving hello terms with them. And if not, look out for the orange SEBCID bibs, and please greet them. I can assure you they will appreciate it. We go back one, please. There we go. Oh, I didn't scroll, sorry. Too many things going on. Using the exact same words I did last year, while their remit is gardening, inevitably they spend a great deal of time collecting litter, particularly in the park. And while this is not necessarily visible to those who may just drive by, if you're someone who actually spends some time in this space, I'm sure you will agree it's much cleaner and tidier than prior to our CID being established. I imagine many CIDs may face challenges in deploying their environmental improvement budgets. We face the inverse of having to determine where best to allocate funds. Over and above the efforts of the Allo Africa team to simply keep our space neat and tidy, I would say our principal aims are twofold: reducing invasives and reducing risk, mainly fire, but also general safety. As the board has truly learned in the past 18 months, this is a complex area. To balance the ambitions of the CID, which has the mandate to improve our public spaces, and deliver services over and above that which the municipality is willing or able to provide, and to balance that against the local parks department, which for want of better words seems to have a love affair with trees. That said, there were some issues which were simply too pressing to be ignored, and in May of this year we removed the 10 or so large pine trees at the start of the walk to the waterfall. You can skip forward a couple of slides for me, we'll see that, there we go. Removed the 10 or so pine trees that were at the start of the walk to the waterfall at the top of Baviaanskloof Road. These were in very, very close proximity of residential properties and a major fire risk. And if we just go back a couple of slides, please. And thereafter, to address the various other trees and vegetation of concern, we sought the counsel of the Green Scorpions, more officially known as Biosecurity, the compliance department of the Department of the Environment, of Forestry and Fisheries. We asked Biosecurity to conduct an inspection of the entire SEBCID area, which was done in May of this year. And we believe as a result, a number of notices are in the process of being issued to a mix of public and private landowners. Specifically in the case of public land, SEBCID will follow up to ensure compliance with these notices. We were very fortunate to have had another major budget allocation from the City of Cape Town's Invasive Species Department, this time to remove invasive species from our river corridor. Now, I know this was something of a painful process for residents in immediate proximity who've enjoyed these trees for many years, but the trees removed were invasive and cause environmental damage in that they consume much more of our water table than indigenous species and crowd them out. We just skip forward a few slides to the final picture, please. So we know the clearing at the Coral Close bionode has left the area looking a little denuded currently, but extensive replanting and stabilisation of the banks has been undertaken. It is realistically going to be years, not months, until the benefits of the replanting really bear fruit, but it will come. We're in the process of installing some discreet signage requesting people be mindful of the fledgling plants. Okay, and sorry, back again, skipping you around. I do want to make specific mention in the environmental improvement portfolio of a wonderful project one of our residents has spearheaded with Kirstenbosch Botanical Gardens. Anthony Goldstein is passionate about propagating locally indigenous rare plants. He's built a relationship with Kirstenbosch Propagation Unit where they activate the seeds he provides and germinate them. Then Anthony and other volunteers go in and prick out the newly sprouted seeds and plant them into seedling trays. Somehow Anthony has convinced Kirstenbosch to then look after them for a year or two, after which half the plants are for Kirstenbosch use and the other half for Anthony's chosen rehab projects, which he shares with our SEBCID and friends of the River Hout Bay. Thank you, Anthony. I think that's a wonderful collaboration with Kirstenbosch. Otherwise, we continue to carefully monitor our public open spaces and schedule targeted clear-ups where necessary, recent examples of which being tidying up the junctions of Campbell and Scaife, and Union and Orange. And on an ongoing basis, we receive advice from Deep Blue, where trimming and clearing is required to ensure our cameras have adequate visibility. With respect to the fire breaks which surround us, we are in regular dialogue with Sandparks and the Cape Peninsula Fire Prevention Association to ensure these are cleared, but this is a constant challenge given the proliferation of alien vegetation. That being said, we are very grateful to Sandparks, which has recently carried out an extensive clearing of the mountainside above our fire breaks, removing much of the proliferation of Port Jacksons, which are a major fire risk. Move forward a few slides, please. So it goes without saying that our location on the urban edge puts us at increased risk of fire. And this is something of which I hope and assume every homeowner is cognizant. The recent fire at UCT put this risk into even sharper focus. And while we have no desire to cause unnecessary concern, the reality is that given current low crime levels in the valley, fire is arguably the greatest risk to our homes currently. To expand on this point and to specifically highlight the role we all have to play, I'll now hand over to Val Charlton.
Thank you.
So I'll let you, if you just scroll down with my mouse and you can move through.
Oh, that's even better.
Well, he'll have to move them as well.
So you're going to move them at the same rate as I'm going to move them, is that right? Okay. So thanks, it's really nice to be here. I think I was asked to talk a little bit about this kind of material, but when I went onto your very good website, I noticed that it was already there. And I thought, well, what is the point of giving you information that you've already got? So I decided to do something a little bit different, which is to give you a little bit of information that I worked on around comparing what happened in the last European fire season and the potential for what can happen to us now. You think it's the mouse? It's not. I haven't used a mouse in 20 years. Okay, there we go. So you'll see, I don't know how well you can see the water firing backwards on this, but I think one must realize that we've been very lackadaisical about our fire risk in the Western Cape on the whole. And while Knysna was the first wake up, I think what happened in Cape Town last year was maybe a second wake up, although we can potentially go back to 2000 where we had the first fire. This is Portugal. And you can see these firefighters are busy running away from the fire. And I think you have to recognize that potentially we are in for that in future. And I don't think for a moment we can think that this is not going to happen in the Western Cape. And why I say that is because all the statistics go to show that it's Mediterranean ecosystems that are bearing the brunt of what is happening. And we're right there. This was a headline. I happened to choose it because the guy's name was Ben van der Merwe, and I thought he has to be a South African. But you can see quite clearly here that it's not the vegetation that's burning, it's the houses. And the reason for that is partly because of ember attack, which is exactly what happened at GCT and which is potentially what you are prone to in the area of the CRD. This was a map that I got some friends in Europe to put together. These were some of the comments. I'm going to flip through this very quickly because I actually want to get to the end and hopefully prompt you to make. Are you keeping up? It's taking a while. Oh, okay, sorry. Sorry, I haven't looked at the screen. I've been looking here and thinking it's capping here. So one of the things that I looked at in this project that I was doing was, how do our wildland urban interface compare with those in Europe? Specifically, not America, not Australia, not Chile, but Europe. Because I believe that that's probably our closest areas around the Mediterranean and Europe. Am I going to have to wave at you? Yeah, is that what you're going to do? Okay, sorry. This is, I think, was Greece. Next slide. Some of you might recognize that slide. I know someone at the back will. That's Glencairn. Very little difference. How do our fuels and our fuel loads compare? I think this was Spain. Next slide. Well, I'm sure you'll recognize that area. And specifically here, what's important is to look at what we call fingers of vegetation. What we're seeing specifically is that fingers of vegetation are what is really helping fires to penetrate right deep into communities. So I'm hoping that you as the CID are going to perhaps do something about it. Invasives are definitely playing a role here, but all vegetation burns. It's what you can do about avoiding it. Next slide. This could be anywhere. But again, here you see these fingers of vegetation and then embers and then fire starting. Don't think for a moment that this couldn't be us this summer, just a month from now, because it could very easily. This is Greece. Vegetation you can see in the front, very similar to our fynbos, but at the back we've probably got pines, maybe cypress, stuff like that. Very similar to some of the vegetation that we've got, especially invasives. Next slide. And then we all know about that kind of fuel. And I think it's worth noting that the reality is that any home is just fuel for a fire. It doesn't make any differentiation. And that is definitely the case with informal settlements. Once a fire starts burning in a home, what it does is it propagates that fire from home to home. People think that this wildfire comes down like a dragon and sweeps through and burns everything. It doesn't work that way at all, actually. So the next question I was asking was, are citizens ready for the possible catastrophe? This was Turkey. This was Cape Town. And I'm going to carry on moving on quickly. Our property is defendable. I think the one advantage that we've got here compared to Europe is a lot of our homes are younger. What I've seen in Europe is that some of the properties are so old, the roofs are not secure, there's a lot of cracked tiles, and ultimately that leads to them not being as defendable as a lot of our properties are here. But then this was Murdoch Valley a few years ago, where the fire came straight down one of those fingers in a ravine where the pines were, various other things. It came straight down the valley, downhill, which is unusual. It's going to potentially what can happen here. And it actually ended up jumping the main road and ending up at the sea. Took a couple of houses out in between. The people along this fire break had done an excellent job of fireproofing their side of the fire break in a lot of areas, but there were these very definite ravines that were catastrophic. So for South Africa, what's predicted by the South African Weather Service this year, I haven't been able to get the update for the months of January to March yet, but the expectation is already a 0.5 degree to 1 degree warmer in December. If we end up with any of these heat dome situations, temperatures could go up substantially. So really moving towards the end now, why do some homes burn and others don't? This is an example of a property in Knysna. It sits on the top of the mountain. You'd think, well, it would burn, but the reality is it was well defended. So everything burnt around it. You don't see them anymore because they're just ash, but there was houses below and houses on either side, and yet that house was untouched. And that tells us a lot. We learn more from what didn't burn than what actually did burn. And this is a good example of having taken the steps to defend your home. Here's a couple more. Wooden houses are not necessarily a problem, provided the defensible space has been taken care of and you've paid attention to the roof. The roof is really very important, and there are other homes you can see there the same thing. What we have discovered is that aluminium gutters are far, far, far better than PVC gutters, because the PVC gutters melt, and then from there they propagate the fire in your building. So it's worth noting if you're building or if you're looking at renovating at all. You can see the gutters. The term clean out your gutters is really one of the most important things you can do. It's so basic, it doesn't cost anything, just do it. Because embers, which are firebrands thrown off from the fire, well ahead of the fire, kilometers ahead of the fire sometimes, has been proven worldwide to be the cause of houses burning down. Okay, so moving ahead very quickly now to my challenge to you as a CID. You do have the opportunity to do a proper risk assessment in this community. You're a very active crowd of people, and there are very definitely things that you could do to put a risk assessment together and then take steps to reduce your risk. Definitely look at all the fuels below the fire break. A fire break has never stopped a fire. Fire break is just a place to fight the fire from. So don't think, oh, well, there's a fire there, we're going to be cool, because you're not. The embers are going to blow into the community and straight over the fire break. So really look at those properties. I'm sorry if anybody's house is shown up here, that's not the intention, but below the fire break is a real problem. We see it all around Cape Town, not just here. And then something that you could perhaps do if you haven't thought about it is look at evacuation planning. And I would strongly urge you to do this. It's very easy to say, okay, well, I'm going to stay and defend. But you know, an approaching fire roaring along is probably one of the scariest things that you can live through. If you have young children, you should evacuate. If there are elderly people, try and find out where they are and help them. And I would strongly urge you to look as a group at an evacuation plan. Even if you were just to mark out exit routes out of your community, it would be a huge help in the case of an emergency. Look at turnaround circles, because you've got big vehicles coming in, you can end up with a traffic jam. There's lots of different things that you can look at. And then think about a refuge area. If you had to evacuate, where would you go? Does everybody know this? Is there some way of communicating this to your community at large? Can you do a trial run? It's a great thing to do a mock-up and actually pretend you've got a fire and mobilize and test it out. I would strongly urge you to do that. And yes, I mean, if you want any help, I'm very happy to come and advise. And then just to close off, I'm open to any questions, but I know I'm sort of in the middle of a meeting.
No, that's fine. I think if anyone's got questions for you, we should take them now while it's
all right.
in people's minds.
But I mean, I think that the reality is that we live in a world of risk. You know, you've talked about the fact that you've got your security risks under control and you actually are living with the risk. And really, this is what I'm saying you have to do here as well. The fire risk is not going to go away, ever. You live in a fire-prone ecosystem. You need to learn to live with that risk and manage your risk. And that's me. Thank you very much. And I hope I put the fear of God in here, actually.
Thank you, Val. Does anybody in the room have any questions for Val?
Yeah, Guy's bound to say something.
Guy, if you let us know what the question is, then I'll repeat it for the benefit of those on the Zoom call.
Thank you, Ms. Charlton.
Pleasure, Dr. Preston.
Could you say anything about the legal risk if you haven't protected taken the protection measures on your property and the fire spreads to other properties?
So the question is whether Val can talk a little about the legal risk if you haven't taken the appropriate measures to protect your property and the fire spreads from yours onto neighbouring properties.
So that's quite an interesting one, and not a short answer. So from a National Felt and Forest Fire Act perspective, which really doesn't apply at a residence level, the Act is quite clear. It said if a fire can start, or a felt fire can start or spread from your property, then you have to take steps to reduce that risk. If a fire starts on your property and spreads to another property, and then another and another and another, then the place where the property where the fire started is responsible for the damages and costs for all of those properties. Now that's the National Felt and Forest Fire Act. There's another piece of legislation in terms of the community fire bylaw, which you might want to put into a newsletter, which talks about the penalties that you might pay from a City of Cape Town point of view if you have not maintained your property from a fire bylaw perspective. So that's any vacant plots, those that are perhaps overgrown with invasives because they're classified as a problem. And there's legislation covering those, and negligent actions that you may do. If you go and start a briar fire and it gets out of control, then potentially you're going to be responsible. The other thing is, I've been working with insurance as a one with Guy. I've been working with the insurance industry for 20 years now, trying to get them to actually do something and incentivize and disincentivize homeowners. The attitude of homeowners has been for a very long time, oh, well, you know what, if we burn down, the insurance company is going to pay out, and you know, so what? But you know what? It's not going to happen much longer. They are really sitting up and taking notice now, and you will find that you're either penalized, or, I mean, what's happening in the States now is insurance companies have just pulled out of certain areas in California. They've said, you know what, we're just not going to have insurance here anymore. So I don't think we'll get to that point, but there's definitely going to be penalties. Does that answer your question? Got more?
Yes, it does. If I could, just a second point, maybe just to to raise the importance of controlled burns, where we can do that, because quite often you get negative reaction from community members to having controlled burns. But if we don't have those, we are going to have worse fires across the peninsula.
So yes, the question was just to talk a little bit about controlled burns and why people quite often feel negatively. In reading your slides, Val, I was really struck, particularly given the times we're living in now, by this quote that it's like a vaccine. A small fire is a vaccine for the biggest fire. We're acting like an anti-vaccine society. So while most landowners will happily welcome a fire crew coming in to save their forests from encroaching wildfires, controlled burns when there's no apparent danger is a very different story. So I thought that was very timely.
Yeah, so prescribed burning or controlled burning is very necessary. We don't do enough of it, and the reason why we don't do enough of it, especially in the metro, is because of air pollution regulations and the number of days that it's safe to actually burn. So, really what we're asking is that you support sandparks, especially when they want to do a prescribed burn in your area. Please don't say, oh, but it's my day to do the washing, because that's what actually happens. Just put up with it. Just close your windows and put on your environmentally unfriendly air conditioning and just put up with it. The guy that said this up top around the vaccine is a guy called Mark Castelnau, who I've worked with in Spain and Portugal. He's very, very, very qualified and has faced probably some of the worst fires that we've ever had. And his comment is very true. I've always likened it to protecting against a burglary. You want to protect your home against a burglary, and you actually do something about it. But then when it comes to protecting your house against fire, you expect someone else to do it. Oh, the City of Cape Town are sending its firefighters. That's crazy. And they're not going to do it either, because you're putting them at risk. So we need to think, why should they put themselves at risk to protect your property when you've done nothing? And that goes back down to, again, the fuels that are around your property. Sorry, I'm getting carried away now. Get quite passionate about this. Keith, I think, had a question. I don't know whether we've answered.
I was wondering, Kinley from Fisher, I've known you for 55 years.
Yeah, it's quite a long time, eh?
How did you get into this?
I blame that man at the back.
I'm going to suggest that you take that offline at the end of the meeting, so that we can get our business of the evening done in time. But thank you, Val. That was fantastic. Great. And I'm hoping that you can maybe hang around. I'm only going to speak for a few more minutes.
I'll hang around and I'll take any questions, and you'll take it from there. Yeah?
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed. Right, glasses back on. Okay, right. So, thank you. Moving on now to the next slide. So turning to the pillar 3 of the CID's operations, urban maintenance. This is a portfolio which has taken more shape in this, our second year, as we've begun to build more fruitful relationships with the municipality to ensure service delivery. I'm not going to say it works every time, but the recent major works in the park are a great example. We've been expressing concern via email to the City of Cape Town Parks Department for some time about the number of trees with dead limbs in and around the park, where children play and people gather generally. And eventually, a real team effort from SEBCID secured a meeting with all the relevant parties from the Parks Department, who agreed to carry out major maintenance, and swiftly did. They still very much don't like felling trees, but they will remove dead limbs. But as a general reminder, when it comes to logging service delivery requests, or C3 requests as they're known, all residents must please log the requests themselves in the first instance, take note of the reference number provided, and only if an undue delay ensues should this be passed on to the CID to follow up. So if you're unsure of how to log a service delivery request, all the information is on our website. And if you do need the CID to follow up on your behalf, then please send us the relevant information, specifically including the reference number. Projects being considered which would fall under this portfolio are possible additional traffic calming on Baviaanskloof Road, some means to better manage parking in the cul-de-sac at the top of Baviaanskloof Road, and improvements to the junctions of Darling Street with Baviaanskloof and Johan with Murray. But I do want to stress that these are all only under consideration at the moment, and no decision or action would be taken without full consultation with local residents, and of course only with the relevant permission from the municipality with whom we are in discussion. Next slide, please. There we go. Lastly, but by no means least, social responsibility. So the two core projects that we set out in the business plan were support for the Hout Bay Volunteer Emergency Medical Services and an EFAR, or Emergency First Aid Response Programme. So in terms of HBV EMS, we've now donated a 12-lead ECG monitor and capnograph to them, and new uniforms, which will bear the SEBCID logo, will follow shortly, and that will complete the trio of contributions we agreed to make. Over and above this, but via HBV EMS, at an almost negligible cost, we funded training for two small groups, one from IY and one from Hangberg, to receive some basic practical first aid training. This wasn't a formal first aid certificate, but simply equipping them with some basic skills to be of use in the event of a medical emergency. We will maintain our relationship with HBV EMS and be open to any other suggestions from them for financial support which could help our community. The lack of a permanent ambulance and an emergency unit in Hout Bay does mean medical incidents are still one of the most serious threats that we face. We are immensely grateful to the 15 local residents who came forward for first aid training and attend the regular refresher sessions. While we hoped never to have to use them, we were perversely pleased that when an elderly lady was recently taken seriously ill in our area, one of our team was among the first to arrive and played a very important role in those first few critical minutes. We will continue to schedule the refresher courses and offer any extra places to other trained first aiders in the valley, specifically focusing on those who play important roles in the community, for example, teachers and security personnel. We had originally budgeted to purchase a defibrillator as a vital piece of first responder equipment for our area, but it became apparent that there was no viable, convenient storage location which would facilitate access to such in the event of an emergency. As I've said, we know that in the majority of cases, CCP WatchCon are alerted to medical emergencies and are often amongst the first professional responders on the scene. So we consulted with CCP on how best to deploy the funds. Since CCP already has its own defibrillator, it was concluded that contributing to the cost of a patient vitals monitor would be of most value, which is what we ultimately did, and that piece of equipment has now been purchased and is in use by CCP. As we've previously communicated, other smaller projects have been identified which the board believed warranted support from SEBCID. Firstly, the IY Ukupila community cleanup, which, if you're not aware, is a group of amazing volunteers who give at least 2 hours, 3 times a week, to picking up litter and generally cleaning IY. We have to date assisted the group in a variety of ways, most recently adding a monthly financial contribution to ensure they can fund lunches for their volunteers, which is apparently a major incentive for the volunteers to lend their time. We continue to support the reading programme for underprivileged children, coordinated by the Dennis Goldberg House of Hope. The House of Hope has recently opened next to the museum on Andrews Road, and the reading sessions will shortly move to this very impressive new facility. And it was also recently brought to our attention that the museum hall itself was in need of upgrades, but lacked the funds to do so. So we were really delighted to be able to identify a social upliftment cause right within our area. And so to date, at very little cost, we funded the building of a storage area behind the stage, which has in turn created a much more aesthetically pleasing stage setting. We've given the area a lick of paint and carried out some very simple, much needed maintenance. And we sincerely hope this will help the museum generate some additional rental funds. And moving on to the next slide, another project that we're very proud of is having been able to donate to fund one of the 2 plastic eating whales which have been installed on Hout Bay Beach. The vast majority of us visit the beach at some point, and if not us, then our visitors or staff or friends and relatives. And dedicating a small amount of funds to encourage people to collect plastic from the beach, which will go on to be recycled, is to the benefit of us all. And full credit to Joanne Frost and the Blue Bay 2030 initiative for the execution. And if you don't know, Blue Bay 2030 is an initiative to try and achieve blue badge status for the Hout Bay Beach by that date. Okay, so, yes, a few giggles in the room. Moving on to our projects, we will return to discuss the specific financials of the projects later on, where we're requesting approval to roll over the underspend in all 3 line items from last year to this, but I want to talk through the projects first. So we've touched several times on the topic of the removal of invasive trees from our space, and of course this spans our environmental improvement portfolio too. So we have budget set aside on an ongoing basis, but also budget earmarked as projects to ensure we are resourced to remove trees on a one-off basis, which are a fire and or safety risk. Our intentions here have unfortunately somewhat been hampered by the stance of the Parks Department, but we are hopeful by bringing in biosecurity that efforts are moving in the right direction, and we should be able to complete the project this year. There really are a significant number of trees sitting on municipal land which are a major fire risk. We have the budget available to remove them. We simply need permission from the landowner, and since that hasn't been forthcoming, we've had to pursue that through biosecurity. So I do very much hope we can achieve those aims this year. We still have plans we want and intend to implement for Union Park, Houtbeek Common, Park at bottom of Andrews Road, whatever you want to call it. It's an area known by many names, but most specifically, we're fully committed to the installation of some permanent skate ramps in lieu of the makeshift ramps still being used today. We've had some productive meetings and extensive dialogue with the municipality on this subject, and all parties are fully supportive, but the wheels turn slowly. Skateboard wheels don't, but the municipal wheels do. So we're currently awaiting the transfer of the land from one municipal department to another, but currently have no visibility on the timing of this, unfortunately. And again, I'm repeating what I said this time last year, that it is wonderful that the play equipment in this park is enjoyed by so many and so frequently, but it does take its toll. And sadly, some of the brand new swings fairly recently installed have been broken. But we'll continue to work with the municipality to ensure the park is maintained in the best condition possible. We'll fund repairs ourselves where necessary. And we're considering funding a security guard for certain hours of the week, early evenings and weekends, to try and ensure the area is enjoyed respectfully. I don't actually believe that there is willful vandalism going on. I think it's over-enthusiastic use of the equipment, perhaps by people a little older than it's designed for. So hopefully if we install a guard, that might minimise that. And finally, we still need to erect signage informing people they're entering a CID area, and importantly that CCTV surveillance is in place. The artwork has been prepared and it's now only a formality to implement. So next slide, please. That brings to a close the remarks I wanted to make on operations. I do just want to recap on all our communication channels though, because nothing that the CID does is of any value if those of you who reside here and are funding it are not aware. So to the very best of our ability, we have a database which contains email addresses for the vast majority of homeowners, via which we send our regular newsletters. Whenever we email out an update, we flag this on our dedicated WhatsApp groups and our Facebook page, and most importantly via our website, which really is a mine of all the information one could possibly need on our CID, as well as having a list of useful contacts at the City of Cape Town. So turning now to the formal business of this evening, and initially an overview of our financial affairs. So our full audited financial statements for our first financial year ended June 2021 were posted to our website on the 5th of November, and their availability was highlighted by an email to all residents, as well as posts on our WhatsApp and Facebook groups. So I do hope that those of you who care to review have had the chance to do so. But I am going to run through the headline figures this evening. I'm going to talk about expenditure and our 4 key pillars to date, explain the surplus we ended the year with, and plans for how that might be utilised. On to the next slide, please. So income and expenditure in our first financial year. To allay the concerns of the most sceptical of you out there, as we've always conveyed, every month we receive our full income from the City of Cape Town, representing every cent of additional rates due from our community. And I stress the word due because regardless of whether or not we as homeowners are paying our CID rates, the city pays us 100% of the amount each month. Well, 97% in fact, reflecting the mandated 3% bad debt retention applied to all CIDs. But regardless of how many of us as homeowners are contributing, the city remits our full budget to us. And this is something that we've highlighted many times in the past, but I think it's worth reiterating, particularly in these tough economic times, that regardless of how many of our residents might be late in paying their rates bill, the city pays us every month to ensure that we can deliver on our business plan. So that delivered us just over £2.5 million in income for our first year, which you'll see in the first line of this table. But I know virtually all of you will already have moved your eyes onto the last line of the table, showing a surplus of just under 1.3 million for the year, And I know at first glance this might seem surprising, but do please bear with me as we walk through the factors behind this. In terms of the core business, we'll break this down in more detail on the next slide, but the primary factor behind the difference here is the public safety portfolio. Our general expenditure was broadly in line with budget, although we made a meaningful saving on our insurance premium and didn't have to use our repairs and maintenance contingency budgets. As I've already mentioned, we didn't spend our entire budget allocation on any of the 3 project line items, only marginally so with respect to the removal of alien trees and fire break clearance. Most significant was the planned improvements to Union Park, which I've talked about, and erecting signage, as I've also said, eluded us in this year. So to reiterate, we're requesting members this evening approve the rollover of the surplus budget of 113,000 across these 3 project areas from year 1 into the current financial year. Next slide, please. So turning to the core business in more detail, as I said, the largest contributor to the underspend by far was the public safety portfolio. And this reflects the fact that our contract with Deep Blue is charged on a per camera basis, i.e. we only pay for cameras when they are installed and running. So while of course extensive work had been done before the MPC was incorporated to map out the cameras, the actual process of building out from the existing 30 or so neighbourhood watch cameras in situ was incredibly time consuming. Each location had to be inspected and verified, a local power supply had to be sourced, and then the camera actually installed. And for many of the cameras along the mountainside perimeter, this involved digging trenches, pouring concrete, waiting for it to set, and then coming back a few days later to install the camera itself. Each camera view then had to be confirmed, and where necessary, our environmental contractor was called out to trim branches. So while we received our first invoice from Deep Blue in September of 2020, we weren't running anywhere close to our full run rate until around April, May of this year. However, from a prudent budgetary point of view, the assumption obviously had to be made that the full cost of the camera installation would be incurred in year 1. It would have been impossible to attempt to map out and cost a timeline of installation. Furthermore, when the budget was prepared, we had not even got to the point of assessing different quotes for delivering a public safety portfolio service, and we were still considering options including acquiring cameras rather than the end-to-end solution that we now have from Deep Blue. The second factor within the core business is an underspend in the social responsibility portfolio. This reflects that while we're immensely grateful for the 15 volunteers we have, it's only half the number we aimed for in our EFAR programme. And in addition, we found out that very few of the volunteers actually had the time to dedicate to achieve level 3 training status, which had been our intention. So we stuck to level 1 training, but this level of competency in turn impacted the first aid packs that we were able to provide. So all of these combined to reduce spend. Plans for our urban maintenance budgets have all taken longer than anticipated, as I mentioned. Progress has been very slow, given how closely we need to liaise with the relevant departments within the municipality, but we do hope to be able to achieve more in this portfolio this year. Moving on to the next slide. I think this slide is, to me, the best illustration of our current financial position. So while we ended the first year with a little under 1.4 million rand in cash, 76,000 of that was committed to creditors. Just over 113,000 is the underspend in our projects, which, as I've said, we are requesting approval to roll over to spend in this financial year. And that brings us to just under 1.2 million. CID policy requires us to retain a provision equivalent to 2 months of CID rates income as a protection against unforeseen cash flow risks. Once this has been built up, which of course it has in our case, it sits in a separate account to be used only if essential. It is thus effectively ring-fenced, but reflects as cash in our accounts. Once adjusted for this, our actual available surplus is just over 650,000 rand. It is worth noting that had we been paying for our current camera installation from day 1 of inception, much of this year-end surplus would have been utilised. Moving on to the next slide, please. So what to do with the surplus? First and foremost, the unequivocal guidance from the City of Cape Town, from our accountant who has over a decade of experience working with CIDs and other CID managers with whom we've consulted, is that if a surplus exists in the first few years of operation, it is highly prudent not to rush to eliminate that buffer. We simply cannot predict what eventuality might lie around the corner. And since the CID is committed to beautifying our area and improving public safety, having a security blanket in the case of unforeseen adversity is a strong position to be in. We've always budgeted, for example, to have recourse to funds in the event we needed to bring in assistance to manage public disorder in our area. We can now take comfort that we have more than enough resources were such a need to arise. But there are a couple of identifiable areas where we could allocate some additional budget. We have been working for months now with Deep Blue to try and source a cost-effective, reliable battery backup system to ensure our cameras continue to run, function during load shedding. And for a variety of reasons, this has proven much, much harder than anticipated. We will continue to work on this. We believe we may have a viable solution to hand, but this will, of course, require additional expenditure. There's also about another 20 or 30 areas around our interior that we've identified where cameras could be installed to extend coverage. And as I mentioned, we're considering appointing a security guard to patrol the park in the early evenings and weekends to prevent misuse of the playground equipment. In fact, much of the above could still be funded from our existing budget, but were we to need or want to utilise some of that 650,000 surplus, the board would need to outline a specific project which would need to be proposed and approved. Next slide, please. So moving on to the proposed budget for next year, year 3 of our 5-year term. At a headline level, this is entirely unchanged from the original budget proposed for year 3 of our term and represents a 7.5% increase on the current year's income. There are, however, some changes within the profile of spend, which I'll explain briefly. The vast majority of the seemingly significant increase in general expenditure reflects that the original business plan had budgeted for a full-time admin assistant, whereas in fact we've opted for a more flexible role paid on an hourly basis as the workflow dictates. So that moves that cost from staff, which no longer exists, to general expenditure. And anticipating needing to share some of the financial burden with the Parks Department to remove the dangerous trees we've identified, we have increased budget in the project somewhat. Next slide, please. Looking at the core business, again, the headline number is largely unchanged, but there have been some reallocations of certain costs. For example, the monthly cost of Stephen and Ali keeping our green spaces clean and tidy had originally been allocated to environmental improvement, but is now allocated to cleansing services. And in public safety, the original budget had attempted to split the cost of the various functions, but since in reality we pay a combined fee per camera for maintenance, detection, monitoring and response, it's been decided to reflect this in one single line item. Next slide, please. As part of the proceedings this evening, we asked members to approve the implementation plan. The plan formed part of the original business plan and budget. It's revised twice a year to reflect progress. The latest version was published on our website on the 5th of November as highlighted, and we hope you've had time to review if you wanted to do so. Next slide, please. Finally, reconfirmation of our professional advisors in the form of Harry Curtis & Co as auditors, Ros Akers of Accountant as our accountant, and Alison, who is our trustee company secretary. Next slide, please. The appointment of directors. So, as per our memorandum of incorporation, a third of the CID board must resign each year, but may stand for re-election. So Jemima Chazelle, Jemima Chazelle and Paul. Let's just confirm Jemima Chazelle and Paul. Sorry, I haven't updated my slide for those of you on the Zoom call, but Jemima Chazelle and Paul have all stepped down, but been renominated. There wasn't a fight for who was going to step down and be renominated, but there was some degree of discussion. So for those of you on the Zoom call, you'll see Farney's name there, but in fact it's Jemima Chazelle and Paul to confirm. Next slide, please. So to summarise voting, on the forms you were handed as you arrived or have been emailed, please mark with an X in the box to approve, object or abstain. You've got 4 items to vote on: the proposed budget for our 3rd financial year, i.e. to the end of June 2023, the proposed implementation plan for that year, the rollover of surplus funds from year 1 into the current year, and the election of the board members. And that, ladies and gentlemen, are all my comments. I will now very happily take your questions. So, as we did with Val, if there's a question in the room, I'll repeat it for the benefits of those on the Zoom call. If we've got questions in the chat room, I will repeat those on the microphone for the benefit of those in the room. I'll take one quickly from the chat room if there is one. No, nothing. Okay, fine. Anybody in the room? Yes.
with regard to the battery backup for the camera system, I didn't see that in the implementation plan. It's kind of a proposal, but I would suggest that it's something we should prioritize before adding additional cameras. Obviously, it's something of a priority if the power goes out whilst if security goes out whilst the power.
Yeah, so the I guess question or rather statement is that while we didn't plan or budget for battery backup in the initial proposal, it really is a priority now, given the extent of load shedding that we're having, and the gentleman is stating he feels it should be a priority rather than adding any other cameras, and we would certainly concur. What's the model that we are currently looking at for battery backup is it's able to power, we think, a node of 4 cameras, and what we've done with our installation, not so much around the interior, although in a couple of areas we have, but along the mountainside perimeter, to reduce the number of power supply points, we've tried to create nodes of cameras. So the lovely Paul, for example, has 5 cameras running from his house, I believe, four. So in that instance, we would be able to just put in 1 UPS to power those 4. So one of the things that we're looking at is potentially just putting the UPS on the perimeter cameras initially to keep the costs lower, but if we can afford to do them all, then we will do so. But yes, I mean, it's clearly a no-brainer. Everybody sees the load shedding schedule, and if you have criminal intent, then while it's certainly not advertised that we don't have battery backup, one could hazard a guess that we don't. I'll take one. So the question is, please confirm what the additional public safety budget spend is for. And I might need a bit of clarification on that one, please. I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to there, but on what basis the increase in additional rates set as high as 7.5%? The 7.5% was what was set out in the very original proposal that was presented to the community, and it's on the basis of which the vote was conducted. So it was quite a simplistic model to grow our income by 7.5% per annum, broadly in line with inflation in South Africa, to reflect the fact that we'll see those increased costs from our suppliers. So there's been no proposed increase to the budget in any of the years from that first presented to the community, and on the basis of which the vote was conducted on whether or not to establish the CID. Sorry,
yes, I had a similar question to that, specifically around the public safety budget. Because from comments that the figures that you've shown, we've spent circa, what, 550,000, and you said that we could have, even if we had to pay for all the cameras fully installed from day one, it would have been, the surplus would have been covered that. So, you know, that kind of, in my mind, means it's around R1 million, or just over R1 million, that entire contract that Deep Blue is worth. So why then is the public safety budget now 1.9 million? So what's the difference? What's the extra 800,000?
So there are other factors that go through the public safety line. There's the contributions to CCP, there's Hout Bay Neighbourhood Watch, there's funds to be available in the event that we have recourse to needing emergency services. But we do, when you look at the surplus that I've outlined to you today is based on the expenditure in year 1. Based on our current run rate with Deep Blue, we would end this year, this current financial year, with an additional surplus. But that is where I'm saying we actually can we are hopeful we could fund the battery backup through the existing budget. So the difference between what our current public safety expenditure is and this year's budget gives us the ability to potentially install battery backup without needing to have recourse to the surplus, because that surplus sits ring-fenced, as I say. It doesn't just dip back into our income and we can choose to spend it as we like. If we want to spend the surplus, it has to be on a specific project. We can't bring the surplus into an operational item because obviously it's a one-off amount. So that's why it has to be an identifiable project. So were we, for example, to buy UPS to install for our cameras, we could fund that through the surplus. But if, which is the model we're currently considering, we add UPS into the contract we have with Deep Blue, where we would be effectively leasing the UPS too, that's an ongoing cost, and therefore that would need to be covered by our ongoing budget. Okay, so the question is, that the 3 million budget is entirely generic with no specifics in the implementation plan. Again, I think that's something I'd be very happy to discuss in more detail, because obviously the budget is broken out by line items, and the implementation plan, if you refer to the detailed document, which is on our website, it's several pages long, explicitly stating what will be done in each individual pillar. So I'm very happy to perhaps discuss that one in more detail offline, but the information is there, as I say, both financially and operationally. Is there an increased proposal to the value in the rand? Our budget, so the question is there an increased proposal to the value in the rand payable? So if you remember in year one, we talked about when we presented the CID proposal to the community, we talked about the way that you would think about what you would have to pay would be 90 rand per 1 million of municipal property valuation. So I think this question is, is that amount going to increase from 90? And yes, it is. It has already increased. But that is not reflecting an increase in the budget other than that which was already forecast. So our year two budget was already forecast to be 7.5% higher than our year one budget. Our budget is based on an absolute figure. The amount per million that we all pay to contribute to the budget is calculated by the City of Cape Town and represents a number of factors. It represents the change in municipal property valuations, if that's happened in the given year, and then the actual cent in the rand paid also reflects that each year the City of Cape Town's cent in the rand applied to our rateable value to achieve their rates changes. But assuming that municipal property valuations don't go down, every year one will expect to see an increase in the amount per 1 million of property value that we pay. And simplistically, it's the 90 increasing by 7.5% per annum. I'll take one more in the room. Kate?
Hi, my dad's in a wheelchair and I find it very difficult to even get him down to the shop through the park. It's almost impossible. He did try to ride to the council about it. He didn't get back to me. I can't do other than struggling with it.
The question is about really the issue of accessibility. So gentlemen being in a wheelchair and finding it very difficult to get around our area. Yes, I concur with you. It's not that long ago that I pushed a pram around our area, and it is difficult. It's very difficult to be on wheels, and that is a tricky situation. It is something where we can continue to engage with the municipality, but they will have their own specific policies on that. It's not something that was in our original business plan, but if the community felt that there was a real need and a real merit to consider installing some ramps in certain areas, then within our urban maintenance portfolio, that is something that we could consider. So perhaps what we could do in our next newsletter is ask people to give comment on whether they feel that in general accessibility is something that should be considered for improvement within the area. Yes.
Is there any data to show what's happened to the crime rate in the SEBCID since we've installed these hundreds of cameras?
Yes. So there's two different ways that one can look at crime. There is the SAPS data. So if you remember from I'm not sure if you were at the first public meeting that we held, and we had Rod from Hout Bay Neighbourhood Watch who came to present, and he talked through some of the crime statistics, and they're all available on the Hout Bay Neighbourhood Watch website. And almost universally, we're seeing a reduction in crime, which is fantastic. It's obviously good news for all of us here. That data has the longer time history, and so I would suggest if you want to see a sort of a pattern over several years, that would be the best to refer to. But I did just go back and look at and find it now quickly. So CCP, since they've been managing WatchCon, they collate all of the calls into WatchCon and categorise them. And I did just have a look back. So from July 2020, when we were established, to October 2021, the most recent period for which CCP has the data from WatchCon, there was 118 incidents reported to WatchCon, 4 of which were burglaries, 4 of which were attempted burglaries and 5 were trespassing. I would stress with those attempted burglaries, whenever there is a report to WatchCon in our area of something what I would deem a serious crime, a burglary or an attempted crime, I will always speak to them to get additional information just to ensure that it's absolutely accurate. And I would say, and I don't want to go into it in a public forum, but certainly on those 4 attempted burglaries, at least 2 of them were perhaps an overreaction by the homeowner and there wasn't an attempt. The 4 burglaries did occur, and the 5 trespassing, I think those are difficult ones to comment on when people feel somebody was inappropriately on their property, but nothing serious ensued. So in the period since we've been established, we have had very, very little incident. Crime in the whole of Hout Bay is remarkably low. I mean, if you look at the estate agents, they actually are marketing the low crime levels, that we have one of the lowest crime levels in the southern suburbs, and they're using it as a way to market Hout Bay as a destination, which I'm sure is going to lead you to the question as to why do we need the cameras?
Absolutely.
Well, the cameras, public safety, if you take yourself back to the very beginning of this process, the first thing that ever happened in putting forward the motion to establish a CID was a survey. So a very detailed survey was drawn up, and we had a great deal of oversight from the City of Cape Town in terms of putting that survey together. It was then sent out to as many of the community as we could reach. The process of establishing a CID requires a minimum of a response rate of 20% to the survey. We actually had 46% response rate, which was a very high response rate. So we had a lot of engagement from the community early on. I think we all very well know our community is very engaged. It's the results of that survey that inform the business plan, and the overwhelming, I could put it up for you if you want to, but the overwhelming, results of that survey are on our website still. The overwhelming response to the survey was the one thing people were concerned about was public safety. The one thing that people wanted to see improved in our area was public safety. 9 of the top 10 most commonly cited responses were in public safety. There were then a lot of other concerns that played into the environmental improvement portfolio, social responsibility, etc. It's the results of that survey that informed the business plan. So the business plan was drawn up with the bulk of the attention and the focus being on public safety, and with the lion's share of expenditure outside of general expenditure, the lion's share being on public safety. And that was the business plan that the community voted on. In terms of cameras, as we've discussed many times, that is now, cameras are the modern day form of what used to be patrolling, neighbourhood watch patrolling. If you want to improve public safety in an area, cameras are generally accepted to be the route to do that. So the cameras have been installed to comply with the aims of the business plan that was published.
I've done an analysis of CCP's figures, and the last year versus the year before SEBCID, the monthly rate, just for crime, not for the medical and all that stuff, the rate for crime is actually doubled. The rate for suspicious activities has stayed exactly the same. So with our £2 million worth of brands worth of cameras, we're actually half as safe as we were before we had them.
Well, obviously, one has to look at absolutes as well, because as I said, if we've had 4 burglaries, that's over 18 months, but say we had 4 burglaries in a year and we had 2 the prior year, then your percentage increase is going to be significant, but we're looking at small absolute numbers. I'd obviously need to see exactly which figures you're referring to and your analysis, but I'm very happy to sit down with you and look at that. I don't think on the figures that I'm seeing from CCP that we are experiencing an increase in crime. If we are, we have a 5-year term for the CID, and if the community don't feel that we have sufficient measures in place, we do have additional public safety budget to deploy in whatever means is deemed appropriate to deliver improved safety.
Well, the figures I've done show it goes from 1.36 reports a month to 2.7 reports a month.
One does just have to be very careful about analysing what those reports are. So, for example,
have some degree of measure, just to say,
well, that's why I went back and looked at what I went through every single month of reporting from CCP and looked at what were serious crimes, in my opinion. There's a couple of domestic incidents. Even when there's a domestic incident, I'll speak to CCP and say what went on. So something that gets reported as a serious domestic incident turned out to be a young drunk couple fighting outside Hout Bay Manor, and Often the true story behind what's reported into WatchCon is not something that is actually a threat to us as homeowners in our area. Obviously burglaries are. Of the 4 burglaries that took place, 3 were actually at the same property within 1 week. And that was what identified 1 weak spot in our network. And within a matter of days, we had a new camera installed to cover it.
Excuse me,
Yes.
is the questioner suggesting that we should decommission the cameras because of the results of his survey? And if so, I would vote against decommissioning the cameras. I believe they've been effective, and whether his figures prove it or not is immaterial. I think they work.
Thank you. The gentleman is just asking whether the query being raised about the efficacy of the cameras based on his analysis of the crime data, whether that means, is he suggesting the cameras should be decommissioned? I think that this is really why one establishes a CID structure, to have a number of years of term in order to put in place the plan, to actually implement the business plan. And at the end of that 5-year term, all members of the community will be asked whether or not they want to vote to renew it. And if it has proven not to be effective, if people don't feel safer, if they don't think that the things that they raised in the survey originally have not improved, that they're not happier, they're not comfortable, then the great thing is, as the analogy that Richard made several years ago, is that it would be a bit like marriage. No one would go into it if divorce didn't exist. And the nice thing about going into the CID of only having a 5-year term is, if at the end of 5 years it's not working, we can get divorced. That has, I think, happened only once in the history of CIDs in Cape Town, that they've got to the end of the 5-year term and members had voted not to renew. But it's a possibility, and everybody will have their say on whether we go forward when it comes to that point. Would you like to follow up, sir, and then I'll come back to it? Okay.
Obviously, the common is a great picture of how healthy House Bay is as far as its environmental awareness is concerned, the cleanliness of the common and its upkeep and so on. So it's very important, and I'd like to emphasize that. The 2 men who are responsible for looking after the common, as you might say, I think it would be helpful if residents could understand or be given the program of what they are supposed to be doing each week. In other words, residents would say, oh, they're working on weeding the common this week, or they're working on the edges, so that we can, if you like, monitor that they're actually doing the job that they're being employed to do.
So the suggested, well, firstly, the comment is that the common is, or the park at the bottom of Andrews Road is looking much cleaner and tidier and representative of how healthy the area is. But perhaps it would be nice if we had insight as to what Stephen and Ali are doing each week, so that we can see where they're working and following up on them. So firstly, they are managed by Andrew, to whom we contract for this service. They're also very closely managed by Jemima, and they tend to come in and check in with her most days as to what they're going to be working on. Monday mornings are always litter in the park, invariably, because it does just get left a complete mess over the weekends, unfortunately. And then our area is really too large for them to get through every week, because they're on foot and it's quite a large geographic area. So between Jemima and Andrew, there's generally a discussion about which areas need attention as each week goes by. Then occasionally we'll have some very specific things that we need to attend to quite quickly. So the stormwater drain at the bottom of where Union meets Orange, that had suddenly become very, very, very clogged up, and then we had to quickly get the guys there to clean it up. But it's something we could certainly consider, is to just pop on the WhatsApp groups. This is what the guys are going to be focusing on this week. Look out for them in your area. I don't think that would be unmanageable. Jemima's nodding, so we'll take that on board. I'm just going to take one more from the chat room now. Oh, okay. All right. Sorry, in the room. I've lost track of. Come back to you.
I want to really commend you guys on what you've done. I don't know how big the community is, how many people are involved in this actively, but I think, just tonight's been enlightening to see the huge amount of initiative that's ongoing. So thank you very much. I do feel, though, that our focus may need to be shifted slightly. I do feel that there's a bit of an overemphasis there has been on security. Hence my previous question, just why is there so much more money now being allocated to security? It's part of all the cameras being installed. is it possible that one could shift one's focus or projects? I feel very strongly that we need to contribute more, or change a bit of focus more towards community development instead. Is it possible that we could, or we pretty much locked in for 5 years, we can't change it? Can we decide amongst ourselves what our shifts and focus areas are?
I'm going to paraphrase, which is that the bulk of our budget is focused on public safety, and should we not be thinking about refocusing that elsewhere, particularly looking at community. So the budget is fixed as it stands, but as I've talked through tonight, there is scope to move some line items around, and that very much happens in the early stages of a CID, because as I say, just one example being Stephen and Ali that clean the park, we had allocated that to environmental improvement, and then our accountant, who's always looking at every invoice and being very careful about what it is, she said, you know, they're really doing cleansing services, so that cost goes there, but then everything that they clean up ends up in bags, and Andrew carts it away in a bucky, so we split the invoice, and that bit goes to cleansing, that goes to environmental improvement. So it is an iterative process, and we can move with the approval of the City of Cape Town, we can move items around within our budget. So in January of every year, we review our current year's budget, and we can request to move line items, and if we're given approval, then we can do that. So, for example, were the Parks Department to come back and say to us, okay, you've had all these notices issued on us by biosecurity, fine, all these trees need to go, but we don't have a penny to do it. And if you think about what Val's just said tonight, we might decide to take some budget from public safety and ask for permission to allocate it to environmental improvement or our projects to really carry out a major programme of removing those invasives and paying for it ourselves. Obviously, the hope is the parks will do it, but we could move that. So we can. One does always have to come back to, though, the survey that informed the business plan. And I can remember having an email discourse with somebody who was very, very, very concerned about the fire risk. And he was adamant we should take every single cent in our budget and use it to cut down every tree on the mountainside, every alien tree. And because that was the single biggest risk to all of us and our property. And while I don't necessarily think it doesn't have a point, we can't do that, because when we went asked people what they were concerned about, that wasn't the overwhelming response. The overwhelming response was the public safety. And there are very comprehensive, strict guidelines that the City of Cape Town sets out in its regulations and policies about how the business plan must be built, and it must reflect the concerns of the community. Because in essence, that's how you start the CID. You say, what do we all think needs to be improved? How do we do it? So when the community's told us what they want improved, one can't then materially deviate the budget. But there is definitely scope for some. I mean, and then on the community, on the social upliftment point, and I'm maybe going to say something they're not going to like, but it's actually quite difficult to find social upliftment within our area. So the museum has been fantastic, and you know, I probably wrapped myself on the knuckles a little bit that we didn't think about the museum before, but it's been great to find a social upliftment project in our area. But we're a relatively affluent area. We're not an industrial area with homeless people on the streets and needing to set up soup kitchens, etc. So where we have found other social responsibility projects, they've been outside our area, but where I feel very strongly that we all get the benefit. So pretty much everybody in this room drives past the police station on a daily basis, I'd imagine, or at least regularly during the week. The fact that the Ukupila community cleanup team are reducing litter in Iwai somewhat, we see the benefits of that on a daily basis. The whales on the beach, as I said, of course, they're not directly in our area, but at some point in the year, I reckon everybody goes to the beach, so we see the benefit. So where we see social responsibility projects like that, and where I'm confident that I can demonstrate to the board and to the City of Cape Town that we as an area benefit from that, then very open to it. So anything that you want to suggest, please do. There are 7 of us on the board, 7 directors, and then Kalita, who's not a director, but who runs our admin and operations. So yeah, it's a team effort. Richard.
I think you and the board, the team are doing a great job. And I suggest that we use the back of our voting sheet to give you a mark out of 10. And in fact, you add those up and possibly publish them. I think they'll be quite factual. But you know, it's a question of balance. This is a complicated society that we're living in and a complicated future that we're going into. And I think on balance, as one of the people that was about So far, so good. You guys are doing a great job.
Thank you, Richard. So Richard just commented that he'd been sceptical about the CID initially, but now feels that we are doing a good job. Trouble is that these two comments that have started with a compliment, I feel they come with a but afterwards, but I escaped that one there. But Guy.
Yes, I've got 4 points.
Oh.
I was going to start also with a compliment, specifically to yourself for the incredible drive that you have behind this, and to Jemima on the environmental side, but to your whole board. So thank you very much for what you are doing.
Thank you, guys. Just commenting that he appreciates the drive that we have, myself and Jemima, particularly behind the environmental portfolio for Jemima.
The second point, having now the buts, the 3% to environment is a very disappointing level, and I would really like to see if there is a surplus that we could put forward some projects that could be enhanced quite significantly. And it does tie in with the public safety, as you say, because of the high risk that Val Chalfen has outlined for us. So if that's something that we could possibly add through the email process and you and your board to consider.
Yeah, so Guy's saying that he feels that the allocation to the environment, did you mention 3%? I might have to come back to you on the numbers, but remember there's also quite a significant proportion of our projects is allocated to removal of invasive trees. So I'm just, I know I have that in here. Yeah. And maybe I haven't split the numbers out here, but if you look at the, no, there we go. Yeah, so 200 in year one was 240,000 rand to the removal of alien trees, and then that number is only marginally lower in year two.
So 3% later, but I'll look at the details and come back to you.
Yes.
I think the third thing was just to support the access comment that the lady in the front there made. And the fourth thing is around the water outages that we've had. Firstly, to compliment the City of Cape Town because their response time is generally very good in dealing with it. But when you look at the problem that we're having, it's largely about water pressure, and that is because as we build higher up the mountain, people are wanting high pressure, and then the old infrastructure is struggling with the pressure further down. We're going to have to address this in terms of how we get some sort of equity into the way in which we deal with pressure. It's also addressing the issue of fire protection and having the water at sufficient pressure. But it is something I think that would be useful for us to address or help to address.
So 2 additional points, guys, supporting Kate's concerns about accessibility in the area. So we'll definitely look further into that. And then Guy making the point that the recent water outages, while the City of Cape Town is to be commended by their generally pretty quick turnouts in order to come and address where we have leaks and bursts, etc., that it's fundamentally an issue of pressure, and that the more that we build further up the mountainside, the more that those homes are going to demand pressure, and the more pressure that puts on the aging infrastructure lower down the hill. That is undoubtedly, I am no expert in this water situation, but I have learned a little bit as we've gone through the most recent outages, and pressure is the main problem, and they are constantly juggling the pressure between the low-lying areas of Hout Bay and the higher areas to try and keep the system going. But then in an ideal world, they'd have lower pressure going to the mountainside homes, and that would cause less bursts. But then those living in those homes are very upset, understandably, that, for example, their showers upstairs don't work. And it's been quite a big issue for those whose properties are rented, because then if they've got tenants and the tenants are ticked off that they don't have water pressure and just go elsewhere. So, as we said, a complex community, and managing the needs of everybody is very tricky. as we've said, though, my understanding is that the entire infrastructure for Baviaanskloof is to be replaced. Council has allocated budget either for this financial year or next. Councillor Quintus seems to think it is more likely this year than next, but in case you hadn't seen, there is the open day that he spoke of when we went through our most recent chaos is next Wednesday, a week today, Wednesday the 8th. It's an open day at the library, and they hold an open day so that they're not constrained by numbers. So some people complained last time that why isn't it just a meeting so that we can ask questions? They hold an open day so it's more available, everyone can go, and also you minimise numbers so people just go through. So I would strongly suggest, if you can, to go along to that open day where there'll be various representatives from the municipality to answer these kind of questions.
Well, there are things that those high-lying houses can do to pump the water to get the pressure they want without imposing all the costs on the rest of society. But the last thing I would like to mention are the illegal abstraction of water from the Baviaanskloof River. Could I suggest that one of the tasks that these two gentlemen could do is go and cut all the illegal pipes so that we stop this plundering of the river? It's already in such a bad shape and unacceptable that we could do that.
Guy's making the point that people living in the higher levels, higher lying homes, there are means that they could themselves increase the pressure to their houses without inconveniencing or putting additional pressure on the rest of the infrastructure. So anybody living in the higher lying areas might want to consider that. And then the point of illegal abstraction of water from the river. This is something that Jemima and I have looked at in detail and at length, and Jemima has worked on for years. The greatest problem is that, as you know, some people do have water rights. The department, unfortunately, so what I have said to the department, or what we have said to the water department is, please give us a list of everybody in our area who has water rights. And then we will know that anybody who is extracting water and doesn't have a water right, we can have a conversation with them. They won't provide us with that information. It's privileged information. So then we said, how about telling us if anybody in our area has water rights, because we strongly suspect that there's hardly anybody. And therefore, if no one has water rights, we can by default assume that anyone who is extracting water is doing so illegally. But they are simply not willing to assist us with that information. So unfortunately, it is impossible and unlawful and just not something we're mandated to do, to go around and cut off those water pipes. But I do feel that the department, if the department wants only people with rights to extract the water, they should do something to help us better understand who has those rights. Maybe you know someone we could talk to. Thank you. Right, I'm just going to check, is there any more? No. Anybody else? Any more questions? Right, with that, I would like to thank you all very, very much indeed for joining us in the room, joining us online. I am always available for questions. I'm always available for questions. I'll happily sit down with anybody who wants to look at budget line items, to talk about expenditure, to look at CCP data. You all know my details. I'm always available. So please don't hesitate to ask. I am just one of your neighbours, as is the whole board. We're just the ones who are elected to this position currently, but the door is always open to any member of the community because we all fund this jointly. So we don't make unilateral decisions. We're implementing the business plan the community voted on. It is an iterative process, and anybody who wants to be further engaged, the door couldn't be more widely open. Finally, voting forms. Oh, I'll read those later. The voting forms, please, as you leave, there's an orange folder in Paul's hand, and please place your voting forms in that orange folder. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Right. Now
Well, one of the things I wanted to ask about with regard to the common